Okay, all right. So, something that I thought would be okay. So actually, no. Something that my friend thought would be a good topic for me to talk about is specifically 3D printers. So I have a 3D printer. I've had 3D printers for a number of years now. Turn that down just a little bit more. Make sure that music isn't too annoying in the background. But I have a bit of knowledge about printers in general. So we'll just kind of, as an overall topic, we'll kind of talk about printers, right? So the reason why my friend suggested I talk about printers is this is something that I have especially recently been talking a lot about, but I have in the past as well. It's a very fun hobby, getting into 3D printing. And when I originally got into 3D printing, how many years ago was it? It wasn't 10 years ago. I want to say 10 years ago, but I don't think it's actually been that long. But I got into it some time ago, and back when I got into it originally, it was kind of expensive to get into. But as a sort of general rule of thumb, at the end of the year, you fill out your taxes, and then if you get a tax return, I hate spending that tax return on anything that is, I hate spending it on like bills or, rent or things that are like food, right? So the fact that it's sort of like when you get your money back for a tax return, to me, it's like I made it through a year of working. It's like, oh, I did it. I made it through another gruesome year of having to work for someone kind of a mentality. I'm going to spend this money on something for me, right? And so, I don't get money back very often, but there was a stretch of time for about 5 years where I was getting money back pretty consistently each year. It was probably because of who I was working for at the time, but the point is that I got like $1,000 back in taxes. And it was like, oh, right. And so I bought a 3D printer, and it cost me, I think it was actually, after taxes and shipping and everything else all included, it was like $1,100 to buy that printer. And it was work to say the least, right? That's kind of sort of like what first got me started on it. But before we get too into talking about 3D printers, I thought maybe we could actually talk about just like your regular printers, like paper printers first, because there's some really interesting things I've learned about those as well, which I feel like is really important information for everybody to know. So if you go to the store and you buy I feel like that music is still a tad bit loud. Hold on a second. How's that? I feel like it always sounds louder to me than it does to you guys, but I don't know. According to this, my audio is more than twice as much as what the background music is, so we should be fine. Anyway, so if you go to buy like just a paper printer, inkjet is one of the more common styles that you're gonna find, right? Like you go to the store, you can buy an inkjet printer for like less than $50, right? Well, inkjet printers are, I don't know if calling it a scam is the right thing. So I worked in retail for 5 years, and I at one point needed a printer, and I want to say we had like a sale on one of the old style printers that we were getting out and taking out and putting in new stuff. And so like, oh, okay, cool. And I got an employee discount, so I got this printer for like dirt cheap. And so I'm thinking, oh, I saved a ton of money, got this, like $60 printer, and I only paid like $30 for it or something stupid, whatever. And I was thinking I was getting some really crazy deal, and I was like, oh, it's just good to have a printer around. You never, like, I've wanted a printer, just a regular printer, for a while too, because every now and again you need to print something. Like, say I'm sitting at my computer and I want to print out, like, here's a really good example of something that I'm always like, I need to be able to print this, right? But say I'm playing a game. Currently I've been playing a lot of Elite Dangerous. I don't know if a lot of is the right word, but currently I've been playing Elite Dangerous, and there's a lot of resources that you need to look up outside of the game to kind of keep yourself whatever, right? So like, say there are a bunch of commodities in this game that like I frequently keep needing to go and get, right? What if I was to look up like or create a list, Photoshop a list, or like, you know, somehow get some kind of list of commodities, and then I could highlight all of the commodities that I always need the most, and I could print that out and stick it on the wall behind my monitor, right? That'd be super nice and super useful, right? I mean, I can always just open up a web page and look it up, but if it's there, it's super nice and convenient. So that's why situations like that was why I wanted 3D printer, wanted an inkjet printer. But I hardly had that printer for very long at all, and it felt like the thing was already running out of ink, and I barely used the thing, right? I'm like, well, maybe it's running out of ink because I haven't used it very much. The ink's drying up in the cartridges or something weird like that. I don't know, right? But you go to buy new ink cartridges, and it cost me like $60 to buy replacement ink cartridges, and that wasn't including black. It was just I want to say it was just the color ones I bought. And I'm like, man, that was more expensive than the printer. That was like as expensive as the printer was originally. That's a ripoff. That feels like a huge scam. Well, lo and behold, I look into it and I find out that just inkjet printers in general, this doesn't apply to all of them, and I'll go into some detail on this later, or in a minute, but inkjet printers are kind of a scam, right? Especially the cheap ones, because you buy the printers and there's tons and tons and tons of things, I put in too many tons there, but there's a lot of things that these printers are doing to basically get you to go in and buy ink. They actually make no money, or they're actually taking a loss on the printers themselves. Like if you go and you buy a printer and it's only $50, they're not making money off of that printer, right? The company isn't. So they make their money by selling you the ink. Well, that's just a business model, right? It's like, yeah, I mean, they get you to buy the printer, you keep coming back to buy the ink, right? It's just a business model. It's just a way. So it's fine, right? Except that they're doing things to the printers to force you to go back and buy the cartridges sooner than you would need to, or they're purposefully like putting hardly any ink in these stupid things so that like they don't go very far. So I found all this information out by watching some, basically just from doing some research. And I learned of a few different ways that these companies get you to buy ink. One, they put chips on these things that might tell you you're running out of ink before you are, like you might only be at like half a cart, like your black might be still like 50% ink. And it'll be like, yeah, you're almost out of ink. And it'll keep throwing this warning at you, trying to influence you to go buy more ink way before you need to. Another thing that they'll do is like they have those same chips on there, so you can't refill the cartridges. You used to be able to just go to a place and they would just refill these cartridges for you, right? Nope, not anymore. They put these like chips on them that don't let you, like you can refill them, but it won't let you use the printer because it like once that sort of warning comes up saying that it's almost out of ink, then it's out of ink. It doesn't matter if you refill it and there's more ink. It's just like, no, you're out of ink. Sorry, you're out of ink. You can't print. Right? And then another thing they'll do is color printers will have the different colors that it uses to create, to combine to create all the different colors that you would need. And cyan is the tricky one. When it has the cyan ink cartridge, it will actually, every time you print anything with black, it actually leaks a little bit of that cyan. I shouldn't say leaks, it prints a little bit of that cyan in all of your black, because by simply adding just a little bit of that cyan to your black, you don't notice the difference. It's not enough that it doesn't look black to you, right? So this forces your cyan to run out really quickly, and then you have to go buy more ink, right? And it's this huge thing. Another thing they'll do is you'll refill the ink cartridges, and then the printer is like set up in a way that it will only do so many prints, and then it purposefully starts printing lines in everything that you print to try and get you to go buy more ink, right? Like you might not even be that close to run, like you probably saw full cartridges and you're going and buying, like it's ridiculous, right? I was hesitant to call it a scam at first, but now that I'm actually talking about it, I'm like, this is actually a scam, right? And so I originally was like, I'm never buying an inkjet printer. right? They're just a freaking scam. Like, I'd rather spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars and buy myself some really fancy office freaking thing and then just try to make it last forever than buy an inkjet printer, right? I'd basically rather throw money away at something that's like quality that is way overkill than what I would need, simply because I can't stand the idea of giving money to these people that are just absolutely ripping people off. Well, lo and behold, that there is actually a solution. So the specific printers that I found are called Eco Tanks. That's like a brand, or a name of a printer. You can look them up. They're pretty popular, but the point is that they're not, what do they call them? They're I can't remember what the phrase was, but they're printers that instead of having cartridges, they have a tank. And so in order to refill these printers, you just buy the ink, right? And then you pour the ink into the corresponding color of tank. And they usually have 4. They have a black, which is usually like twice as big as the other ones, the colored ones. And then there will be 4 colors, which is like, it's like cyan, magenta, and actually, now that I think about it, I think that they have 5 black and then 4 colors, and it's like cyan, magenta, yellow, and some other color. I don't know. It's not like the really old style printers where it's like red, green, and blue. They now use different colors. But the point is that you can just buy the ink. Well, you look up the ink. The ink's really not that expensive. Like, you can buy like a complete set of all the ink you need for about the same price you would pay for cartridges for one of these other printers, right? And it doesn't just give you a little cartridge, it gives you a substantial amount of ink. And the business model with these style of printers makes way more sense, because the printers are quite a bit more expensive. Like, you can pretty easily spend like $500 on one of these printers. And what's even better is you're spending a lot more money on the printer, but not only are you getting a printer that can like print and you just buy cheap ink, but they oftentimes come with a lot of other features, like a scanner, like they'll have like the one I really want to buy. And like the Eco Tank has a lot of different styles, but the one I really want to buy actually has like a fold open top, so you can put your sheets in and then scan them. But it also has a feed where like you can put the papers in, it will feed them through and scan them that way. And I don't know how true this is, but with my limited experience that I spent working in a photo center, those ones where you put the paper in and it feeds through and just scans the paper that way, tends to work really well with text documents. But if you're trying to scan like a photo, that always seems to work a lot better when you have the bed style, where you put it in the corner and put the top down and then it scans that way. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's always kind of like, maybe it was just because that's how we did it at that store, because we had a little scanner that we would scan paper documents into that had like text on them, and we'd make copies that way. And those it was like you would just feed it in, it would send it through, and you say I want 15 copies, and then it would pull through, scan it, and then just print out a bunch of copies. But then the top down time was always like you'd scan it in, and then it would pull it open in like an editor, and then you would edit it how you want and then print the photos. But yeah, the one I want to buy, it actually has both of those features, and it's a tank printer, right? And I want to say it's gone down in price over the last few years, because when I originally looked at that one that I wanted, it was like a $500 printer. But I want to say I looked back at it again recently, and it was only like $350 or $400, probably because it's older now and they've come out with newer models. But yeah, if you're going to buy a printer, buy one of the tank printers. Right, it doesn't have to be that specific brand. There's a few others out there, but you pay a lot more for the printer up front, but your cartridges, or not cartridges, but your ink that you order is so much cheaper, and you end up, the printers just work, right? Like, they do what they're intended, and they just do it until they run out of ink, instead of like all the scam stuff that all these other cheap inkjet printers are doing. It's ridiculous. Basically, don't buy a $50 printer. Like, just don't buy for any $50 printer. But that's sort of what I learned about regular printers. That is, please don't just go buy a cheap. You're just feeding money to these companies. You're gonna replace the printer after a year. Not worth it. But yeah, anyway, so working in a photo center, that was some interesting stuff I learned about those stuff. I actually still have that printer. I need to just throw it away. But yeah, anyway, so back to 3D printers. Maybe we should talk about what a 3D printer is for anyone that doesn't know. So like your regular style paper printer prints on like a sheet of paper or photo paper or whatever, right? And so it's just printing. Probably can't see that very well, can you? No. Wait, can I do this? Well, hey, Azzy, welcome to the stream. I don't know how to draw this very well. Maybe I'll just come closer to the camera here. So like a regular printer will print on like a sheet of paper, right? Oh yeah, that is not visible at all. Okay, we're gonna not worry about trying to draw this out, but basically a paper printer will print on just like a sheet of paper, and which is essentially two-dimensional, whereas a 3D printer, it actually prints very, I don't know if I should say very similar. The methods it prints in are totally different because it uses filament instead of ink, but you can print just a single layer, and then when it's printing a 3D model, it prints a single layer, and then it moves up and it prints another layer on top of that layer, and then another layer on top of that layer, and it just keeps building up layers until you end up with a 3D model, right? Well, so I bought my first 3D printer some time ago, and I had to actually build it. This was crazy now that I think back on it, because 3D printers nowadays are so cheap, and they're so much easier to get into than when I first started. So my first printer was called an Ultimaker Original Plus. So Ultimaker's first printer was called the Ultimaker Original. Had a glass bed, no fancy features like a heated table or anything like that. Those weren't very common back then. And then they made the Original Plus, which just added a heated bed. So when it prints, it's printing using filament or plastic. Basically, it's a spool of plastic, right? And it pulls that plastic through a tube, goes into what is basically a hot glue gun, right? The tip is like if you had a hot glue gun, it's got that metal tip that gets really hot and it melts the. Actually, I don't even know. Are glue guns? You always call them a glue gun, but is the stuff that it's heating up and melting actually glue? I wonder if it's actually just some type of plastic, and you're basically gluing things together using like a plastic. Anyway, so yeah, it kind of works like that, right? It's just feeding this plastic in through this hot end, or what looks like a glue gun tip, and then it comes out, and then it places a layer of it down, and then you kind of layer your way up. The heated bed, the heated table helps because this is plastic. Now, the heated bed isn't hot enough to melt the plastic, or it shouldn't be, but it's hot enough to keep the plastic just malleable enough that it sticks to the table, right? That way, when it's printing up multiple layers, it doesn't shift or move. You want it to be totally still so that when the printer's going up, it's accurate, right? Well, so I get this printer in the mail, and it's wooden. My first printer was actually made out of, the frame and everything was made out of wood, and I had to actually piece all the pieces together, and it had this like really thick book, which was like all the steps to put this thing together. And you build the printer yourself. And when I first got it working, and it was like I got it actually like creating prints, it was honestly like the coolest thing ever. Like just being able to be like, all right, print me this. What was the first thing? It came with the USB stick, and there was a print on it, and Ultimaker has like a little Ultimaker robot, and that was your test print. It came on the card, so you put the card in, you say print this robot, and it prints a robot, and then you get this thing, and you're just like, holy crap, I just printed this thing. As he says, my friend printed the Yippee thing. I haven't heard of that. What is the Yippee thing? Then there's so many. This is one of the coolest things about 3D printing as well, is that basically everyone is making everything open source. Tons and tons of companies are designing and making these things, and then you can just look up like how these things are made, and all the information is there. I think for the most part, what these companies are doing is more recent companies, especially, well, maybe I shouldn't say more recent companies, but I think what a lot of these companies are doing is they design and make a printer, and then they sell it. And then their old style printers, they release all the information on it. Like, they make everything open source, right? Their newest one that just come out, I think they don't do open source until they've come out with a new one. So like, they're constantly coming out with revisions and new updates. So if you want their newest stuff, you would buy it from them. But then if you want if you wanted to design and make your own printer, you could look at their older models and just look up how it's made and all the source code and everything, and you'd have all that information, which is really cool. But the fact that everything's so open source is kind of like Blender. I've talked about Blender in the past, but Blender is a free program, and that's a big advantage. I don't know if it's open source, but it's a free program for 3D modeling. And the reason why being free is such a good thing isn't just that you save money getting the program. It's actually because so many people use it because it's free, that if you want to learn how to do anything using Blender, there is someone who's made a tutorial on it, right? Or there's some information out there, like someone's dealt with it. Whereas these programs that cost so much money to get into, or they are a subscription-based thing, when you're trying to find information on them, it's you almost need schooling to use these programs, right? Whereas with Blender, you can get good at Blender with no education. You don't need to go to school, and you don't need to pay anything to get good at Blender. All that information is out there. Somebody's done something on it, and it's all free. And that's sort of the idea behind these printers, is that they're getting better and better and better so fast, simply because so many people are making everything open source. Let me take a drink really quick. Oh, as he says that the yippee thing is like a little dog. That's cool. I bought a new printer. Was it last year? Was it last year? It was either last year or the year before. I can't remember exactly. It's not really important. But the point is that I bought a new printer recently, and it's made by the company Creality. And theirs actually came with two test prints on the card that came with the printer. It was a bunny and a boat, and I think the boat is the one that's sort of like the most well known, but I printed both of them and I was absolutely blown away. And oh, okay, I remember why I bought that printer. So my original printer, I kind of stopped using it for a while. I kind of put it away. I want to say I was having some troubles with that printer, which is why I put it away, because I was troubleshooting it and it was becoming kind of a pain in the butt, and I was spending a lot of time just trying to get the printer printing properly. And I was spending more time just trying to keep the printer running properly and not actually doing any printing. And so it sort of became a little bit of a chore, and so I basically put it in storage and stopped using that printer for years, I guess, right? Well, my brother bought a 3D printer, and I was like, wow, you bought a 3D printer, right? And we're talking like not even 5 years after I stopped using my printer. And I was like, wow, how much did that cost you? That, and he's like, oh, it wasn't that expensive. It's like they did a sale, and I was able to buy this printer for like $130. I was like, you bought a printer, a 3D printer, for $130? I'm like, bull crap, right? Like, it must be a tiny or really crappy printer. I went over and looked at his printer, and it actually has a larger print bed than mine. And I'm like, what? Like, not a lot bigger. It was like 10 centimeters bigger in each direction or something. But I was just like, and the design is totally different than my printer. And and he printed some stuff and showed me, and I'm like, these are actually like really good. And I was like, for the normal price of that printer is like $150. And I was like, for $150, that's kind of insane. So I started looking into it, and I found out printers have just made a shiz ton of progress over the last like few years, right? And getting into 3D printing is so much more affordable than it used to. I would still say that it's still one of those hobbies that you can't just, like, if you bought a paper printer, you just kind of expect it to work, right? You print something, it prints, that's it, right? With 3D printers, it's not quite that straightforward. Like, there are a number of things that you will need to learn and things that you'll need to get in the habit of doing in order for them to consistently put out quality stuff. And that's still true. However, it is so much easier to get into now, and the maintenance has become more streamlined than it used to be, right? For example, my old printer had a heated bed. Every printer now comes with a heated bed, but it was a glass bed, and in order to get the prints to stick to it, the heated bed wasn't enough because the smooth surface of the glass didn't hold the print down very well. So you had two options: buy some painter's tape and put a layer of painter's tape down and print onto the painter's tape. I did that for a little while, but then the other solution was you take a glue stick and you rub a glue stick all over it and wait for the glue stick to dry, and then you print on that. That's what I started doing, and that was better because it would last. It would still last a while, just like the tape, but most of the time when you print in the center. You could also kind of go through and just kind of like touch up. You don't have to like clean the entire bed after, like if you do like 10 prints, you don't have to clean the whole bed and then reapply. Whereas with the tape, it's also kind of annoying to put on because you put the layer of tape down, but when you put the next piece of tape, you want to make sure that it's not overlapping. Otherwise you have a little rise or a high spot and that can screw up your prints. So yeah, the glue stick was better. But with newer printers, you don't need to do that either, right? So they have the heated bed, but then like mine has a glass. Wait, is it glass? Yeah, mine has a glass bed, but it's textured. It has like, it came with like I don't know, I want to say paint, but some kind of surface stuff on it that makes the print bed like have a bit of a texture to it. So and it works so well. Like through all the testing that I'm assuming that these companies have done, it actually works really, really well. So the first thing I printed, I still told it to print. I went off and did something else. I came back later and it had not only finished, but the print bed and everything had cooled down, and I went to pull the print off, and I had like my scrapey spatula thing to help get it off, and I went and grabbed it, and it just tink, just like that, just tink, right off, popped right off the table. I was like, what? I was like, it blew me away. And then I do another print, but at this one, as soon as it finishes, I'm there and I'm trying to pull it off the print bed and it won't come off. Dude, it is stuck. It is stuck hard, right? And I found out that with newer printers, especially ones that you're using like a textured glass bed, the textured surface works so well when the print bed is heated that you almost can't get them off, right? So it's better to just wait, right? So when the print finishes, you give it an extra like 20 minutes for everything to cool down, and then when you go to pull it off, it will literally just right off, no problem, just easy peasy, right? And the best part about that is when it comes off so easy, you have to level that bed so that the print head doesn't like contact, like, so it's just the right distance from the print surface. And if you're sitting here trying to yank stuff off, you're going to screw that up, and you're going to have to go back through and like re-level that bed. And that's actually one of the things I was just recently talking to my friend about, is the whole leveling thing. That's actually a slight pet peeve of mine. I gotta be careful that I don't fall into the same, I don't know if trope is the right word, but fall into the same explanation as a lot of people. But when I say that you have to level the bed, some people think that leveling the bed is just making sure that the bed is level. The problem with saying leveling the bed is that when you level something, you're leveling it to gravity. Like if I'm trying to make sure that my washing machine is level, I'm going to put a bubble level on it. I'm going to try and make sure it's level, right? And that bubble level helps you to make sure that it's parallel to the gravitational forces that are pulling down on it, right? But with 3D printers, that's not so much important. I've seen people print sideways, upside down. I saw somebody who made a backpack and put a 3D printer on a backpack and was powering it with some kind of, I guess, battery. And he was just walking around like a school campus with this printer running on his backpack, right? So obviously the printer being level isn't actually that important. What is important though is that the print bed is parallel. Well, it's like parallel to the print head, right? In machinery work, I think they call it tramming, right? So you'll get your block, right? So like, let's say you have like a big like CNC machine or whatever this thing is, right? And you put the big block of, I don't know, aluminum or whatever. We'll say aluminum. I'm not sure exactly. I haven't done machinery work, but we'll say they put this big block of like aluminum in here, and they're gonna have this machine carve away and to make whatever the part is. Well, when you put this in, the drill that goes around has its axis that it moves on, and so you got to make sure that this part is situated parallel to that surface, right? So you're going to put it in, and you're going to go you got all this testing and the stuff that you do that, like, and it's similar to printing. When 3D printing, to make sure that the bed is quote unquote level, you're going to move the print head to one corner, and you're going to use a gauge. A lot of people use a piece of paper. They say that the distance the print head should be from the print surface is about the thickness of a piece of paper. I decided to invest in shims. I actually shouldn't say I didn't invest on shims for my printer. I actually had a shim thing for when I tuned my motorcycle, but yeah, it's just a little thing with a bunch of thin pieces of metal that are at different thicknesses. And I'll use that, and I kind of feel underneath that print head, and you slide it underneath between the print head and the print bed. And there's adjustment screws on the bottom of the bed, and you twist those to bring the bed closer or further until it's just the right distance. I want to say the distance is like 0.08 millimeters thick or something. It's like 0.08 to like 0.1. I think that's right. It's like between 0.08 and 0.1. Yeah, anyway, so you put that guide in there, and you make sure it's just about right, and then you move that print head to the other corner, and you do the same thing, and you go through all four corners. And then I like to go 2 or 3 times checking, because I feel like as I'm adjusting different screws, it kind of like might adjust, it changes all that adjustment, so I just like to make sure. But after you've done that, your print head is now level to the print bed, right? So instead of trying to adjust the level to gravity, you're adjusting it so that right, so the print, the nozzle is just the right distance across the entire surface. But yeah, a lot of people get confused by what leveling a printer is, because the printer, again, doesn't have to be level. Like, you can literally print upside down, or sideways even, right? But yeah, so where was I? I got all distracted. I was talking about the printer I had. Oh yeah, so my brother bought this printer. It only cost like $150, so I start looking into printers. And I go to the same website, which was Creality, and they have a lot of different printers. They've got some really high-end ones. They've got some very cheap, kind of like, I don't know if I would say introductory, but introductory is, I don't know, yeah, introductory might actually be the right thing. So their cheaper printer, which I think their cheapest is like $150, is not necessary. If this is something you want to get into, it's not a bad investment to buy their cheapest one, because their cheapest one doesn't have quite as many features as the ones that are even just $50 to $100 more. But you can learn a lot from the cheaper printers on printing and get better at 3D printing. I opted to buy, I wanted one that was bigger than my previous one. I want to say my original printer I purchased had a print surface of 210 by 210 millimeters. That $150 one that they sell, I think, is like 220 by 220, so it's a little bit bigger. But with the 210 millimeter print surface I had on my old printer, I learned that, let's say I wanted to print like a helmet or some sort of cosplay item that I could wear, that print surface was just barely too small to print like a helmet that was wearable. Right now, I could take a helmet design and just cut it into like 4s and print individual parts and then glue it together, right? So it is still doable. It's just more work. And I thought, how cool would it be though if I could print something like that? Now, again, the Creality printers are slightly bigger, so I could have just got one of those, but I was like, I want bigger still. So I went ahead and bought myself it's called I think it was called the Ender 3 Max Neo. It's got a really big surface. It's, oh, what is it? It's like 320. I think it's 320 by 320, and its height is like 340 or something, right? Quite a bit bigger than a lot of printers on the market. Not the biggest, but quite a bit bigger than a lot of them. And to be totally frank, I am not likely going to use that whole surface. It is definitely overkill. I didn't need it. But at the same time, the printer only cost me like $300. Was it 300? 350? Which to me is really cheap for a printer compared to what I'm used to. I was like, yeah, this is like it's worth it in my book. That being said, though, I've become so focused on money as of late because everything is becoming more and more and more expensive, and everything's just getting harder and harder and harder to afford, that I'm kind of at the point now where it's hard for me to spend money on anything that that is just like a hobby, for example, something that isn't going to make me money. But 3D printer was pretty easy to justify, since you can actually make money off of it. I can print things and charge people for them, right? And it's a hobby, and it can save me money because, like, actually, here's a good example of something that I want to 3D print that I haven't modeled yet, but I plan to. So I bought these blinds for my old apartment, and I used them to separate different parts of, and these aren't blinds like for your window. They're room divider blinds, right? So it has this bar, this adjustable bar, and these big thick curtains that you can use to divide a room. And in my old apartment, I bought two of them. One of them I used to separate my kitchen in the middle, because I had sort of like a kitchen / dining area that was also like the living room, right? It was all kind of just like one big area. So I used one set of blinds to separate my kitchen area, and then another set to divide off my living room. So my living room was no longer in the dining, and I basically turned my sort of dining area, because I was living by myself, I don't really need a dining area, I just eat at my desk. So I turned that sort of dining area into my computer room, and then I had my kitchen, and then my living room was my sort of Vrchat. I don't know if Vrchat's the right word, but it was my VR room. I turned my living room into just a VR room, which was I actually really liked that too. Every time I'd order a pizza or something, they'd always like, you open the door to the living room and like they see like you got all this VR stuff set up. It was kind of a fun talking point. But yeah, so those blinds, those room divider blinds, I'm in a new apartment now. Same place, but I'm in a 2-bedroom place now because my old building burnt down. And I didn't lose anything, and I was fine in the whole situation, but I had to move into a different room. Well, those blinds don't really fit anywhere here. I did put one up to sort of separating my kitchen, because there was a spot that I can fit one there, which works okay. But I don't have anywhere to set these other room divider blinds. And I thought, it would actually kind of be a good spot. I set my computer up in my living room again, by my front door. But I don't really, like, if I have a delivery or something, I don't necessarily need people being able to just sort of look into my whole house. So if I could somehow section off the front entrance area, then that would be kind of a good spot to put that divider. But there is no flat walls to run this bar across. Well, I could 3D print a bracket that I could screw into the wall and just basically set this bar on, right? I can make a custom bracket to set this bar on and run it angled, right? So instead of it pressing against two different walls and sticking to the wall using pressure, it would be coming off of one wall at like a 45 degree and going into another wall at like a 45 degree. And I could just set it on like a bracket that could like hold it. And then those brackets would just screw into, say, like some studs or something like that. And I could even do that with the one I have now. Even the one I have now that's pressure set, going and sort of dividing off my kitchen area, I've had it fall once already, probably because I didn't tighten it quite enough. But I don't want it to fall again since it's right above a window. Now, when it fell, it busted a couple of the things on the blinds, and so it's like I don't want that to fall again. If I put up a curtain, that'll help, because if it falls, it'll just fall on the curtain rod. But if I was to put a bracket underneath it, I could hold it up using a screw, and then I don't have to worry about it ever falling, right? And that's just an example of something that you can do with like 3D printers. Custom weird situations like this that you run into are pretty easily solved if you can just do some very basic 3D printing or 3D modeling and then print them on your printer. And even if you don't know any 3D modeling, there are websites where you can get tons of these designs for tons and tons of things. Thingiverse is actually, when I first got my printer, I couldn't really do any 3D modeling. And so I just went to Thingiverse and I would just download free models off of there and print all kinds of cool things. One of the coolest things I printed that got people talking about this stuff a lot was there's a T-Rex skull, and then there was somebody modified that original design and designed some antlers. And the antlers were just designed to, you could just hot glue them onto the T-Rex skull. And so I printed both and put antlers on this T-Rex skull, and it was so cool. It looks so cool. Just the freaking antler T-Rex. Oh, it was awesome. So fun to look at. But yeah, so I guess that kind of explains the differences between like a normal printer and a 3D printer and sort of how I got into printing. Oh, I guess we could also talk a little bit about, so I bought this new printer, right? And I mentioned that it's hard for me to justify buying anything that's not going to somehow either save me money or make me money, right? And so it's pretty easy for me to justify buying the printer. And of course I ended up spending a little bit more than I probably needed to or should have. But I've been, oh, I gotta sneeze. I recently ran into a vacuum pump. So my parents have a freeze dryer, which uses a vacuum pump, and they were having problems with their vacuum pump not pulling enough vacuum. So they replaced their vacuum pump with a nicer one. And I was like, hey, do you mind if I take your old vacuum pump, right? My thought process was, I can take it apart and try and fix it. If I can get this vacuum pump working again, I get a free vacuum pump. Well, why would I want a vacuum pump? Right? Like, who has uses for vacuum pumps? And if you look up vacuum pumps, almost everything you find is like using a vacuum pump to charge air conditioning units and stuff like that, right? Well, this vacuum pump is like a $400 vacuum pump, but there is a use for a vacuum pump if you have a 3D printer. So again, 3D printers can be used to print all sorts of things. Well, one of those things is a mold. You can design a 3D model and then pretty easily just design a box to go around that 3D model, and basically you invert that 3D model. So now instead of it being an additive process where, so with there's different ways to sort of like make things. There's additive and subtractive, and then those the third one is like combination or something like that. Like if you're baking, you're making things by combining things together, and then additive is 3D printers, right? The 3D printer is adding layers to create an object, whereas like I want to say a CNC machine is a subtractive process where you start with a block and it cuts away material to get to essentially carve out an object, right? So that's subtractive. But you can kind of like take a 3D model and you basically sort of like make a box around that 3D model, and then instead of it creating the 3D model itself, it's still an additive process, but instead you're sort of like making a box with the negative image of a 3D model, right? And so then what you can do is you make the 3D model by pouring like epoxy or silicone. Those are the two I know right off the top of my head, but I think there's other things you could do too. Possibly even plaster. Like what if I went and bought like some of that stuff, what's it called, plaster of Paris or whatever, mix them up and pour it into a mold and make like, oh, you can also do wax. I forgot about wax. You can make candles. Actually, that's a really good example, is candles. maybe not in this case candles, but I don't think you really need a vacuum pump for candles. But if you're wanting to make something out of like epoxy or silicone, you have to mix it, right? So you take the two parts, you mix them together, and after you mix them, they're full of bubbles. Well, those bubbles are a big problem because then your part will have all these like holes, or it'll have imperfections and whatever. Well, that's where the vacuum pump comes in. You mix your epoxy, you put it in a vacuum chamber and suck all the air out with the pump, right? And then it will bubble out and pull all these bubbles out, right? And it takes like, I don't know, it's like 10 minutes or something, and it pulls all the bubbles out of that mix. And now you're left with your mixed epoxy with no bubbles in it. And then you pour that into your mold that you 3D print and wait for it to cure. And then you can pull your mold apart and pop out your whatever it is, right? Like I've seen videos of like this guy had a skull, and he showed how to turn a 3D model of, was it a human skull, like the model, or I don't think it was, I don't think it was like, I think it was just some like, I don't know, but it was basically just like a model of like some cool looking like skull thing. I don't think it was like I think it was, anyway, it's not really important. The point is that he showed how to turn that 3D model of a skull into sort of like a box that's the negative of a 3D model, right? So it's two pieces that you 3D print, and then you could piece them together. And then he, I think, did he use silicone? Oh, no, I think he used epoxy. Yeah, and then you pop those apart, and then you're left this cool, like, I don't know, it was really neat. And the cool part about using a 3D printer to make a mold versus just 3D printing the part directly is that curing something either out of, well, basically out of whatever, is a lot faster than 3D printing the part, right? Like if I had, let's say I have like that same skull and it takes 3 hours to print the thing. Well, it only takes like 20 minutes for it to cure what if it was like, I don't know, silicone or epoxy, right? And then the wax is actually really cool too. Again, you don't need a vacuum pump for wax, but you can make your mold for whatever it is that you want a candle of, and then you put your wick down in the bottom and pull your wick out the top and center it and hold it down with like a, I don't know, paper clip or something, and then pour your wax in and wait for the wax to cool. I think wax takes a lot longer to cool than epoxy or silicone takes to cure, but then you pull it apart and you have a cool, like, how cool would it be to, like, I don't know, say you're playing Vrchat and you have your 3D model in Vrchat, how cool would it be to make that into a mold and like make a, like, I don't know, make a candle of it or something and put it in your house? That's pretty fun. I don't know that character models would be the best idea. Actually, speaking of which, how about we talk about another type of printer that's out there? Another type of printer is resin printers, right? So you've got your typical normal 2D paper style printers, and then there's 3D printers. One type of 3D printer is the filament printer, and that's what I bought. My original one was an Ultimaker, and now I have a Curality Ender. But then there's epoxy printers, or epoxy, what am I talking about? There's resin printers, and those are, if you're going to get into printing, I don't recommend getting into resin printing first. It's far better to get into filament printing, because this song is kind of hard. Let's switch this song, shall we? Doesn't really fit in with what we're talking about. Anyway, so filament printers, depending on the type of filament, that's actually something I didn't talk about either, was when you're printing with filament printers, there's all kinds of different filament that you can print with. The most common is probably PLA. PLA is, I believe it's a vegetable-based plastic. It's made using like corn or something like that. It doesn't have a strong odor when you print using it, and it prints at a pretty low temperature. It's relatively it's one of the easiest types of plastic that you can use. And then there's ABS plastic. ABS is a petroleum-based plastic, and it does have an odor, and it's not incredibly toxic, but like, if you don't really want to be around it necessarily while it's printing, because it does stink, and it's probably not the healthiest thing to be inhaling. But if you're printing with PLA, you can very easily just print with it in your house. And these, oh man, that's the other thing too, is these new printers are so dang quiet. My printer is so quiet, I could just be printing with this thing right next to my bed and I would have no problem sleeping, right? Whereas older printers are so much louder. I'm really excited about how far printers have come in that regard. It's pretty cool. But with ABS plastic, the petroleum-based plastic, you're going to want to kind of either have it in its own dedicated room so it doesn't stink up the house, or have like a garage that you can use to print it in. Ideally, you want it in a controlled temperature environment, because if it's getting too hot or too cold or whatever, it's going to be hard to get consistent results with your printer. So keeping it indoors is easier. But with filament printers, that's pretty easy to do. Just print with PLA, use it in, I don't know, your bedroom if you want to, and no problems, right? Resin printers, I don't recommend getting started with, because resin printers, kind of like ABS plastic, they have strong smells and they use chemicals, and there's a lot more to them. The advantage of resin printers, however, is they can print with a lot more detail, but smaller. So filament printers, like for example, I got the Max Neo and it was like, I want to say it was like $300 or $350 to buy that printer. I've got a very big print surface. I can print very, very large things. I can print things that might take a week to print. That's how big these prints can get. It's kind of insane. But with resin printers, they're oftentimes a lot smaller. But if you wanted to print something like a figurine, a resin printer does a much better job of printing like a figurine. They have kind of a reverse process. So the way a resin printer works is you have this print bed, but the print bed, instead of being low, and then it kind of prints up off the bed, it's the opposite. The print table will come down and go down into resin, and then it actually uses light, and it cures the resin, which, right, so the print bed comes down into this chemical, and then it uses light and it cures the resin onto the bed on the bottom of the bed, right? And it does one layer at a time, I believe, just like kind of like a filament printer, and it cures a layer onto the print bed, and then the print bed moves up a little bit, and then it cures the next layer onto that, and it kind of, you'll watch the print bed sort of like, I shouldn't say you'll watch, as I understand it, with resin printers you can't really watch the process happen, or at least not as easily, but the print bed will come up out of the liquid and it kind of rises up, and you'll like the thing gets cured from the resin, and it just kind of comes up out of the liquid, right? And that's really cool, but again, there's a lot of chemicals involved. And when the print finishes, you have to remove the print, being very careful touching all these chemicals, so you're going to want some gloves. And I don't think you can just buy any generic gloves. You actually need to have like decent gloves or nice gloves, thick gloves, whatever, right? If you bought just cheap, like, if you bought like some just cheap, like, latex gloves like they use in like the restaurant industry, those I believe can be kind of porous, if I remember correctly, and so if you were to use those with chemicals, those chemicals can seep through the glove and still react with your hands. So I'm pretty sure you have to buy, what are they called, nitrile? I think you have to buy nitrile gloves. I'm not 100% on this, keep in mind I don't have a resin printer, but yeah, so you remove the print, right? And then you have to, I believe you have to clean it. So you have like, I want to say it's another chemical that you're going to put this print in, and it's like a neutralizer. It reacts with the chemicals, the resin that's used on the print itself to neutralize that, and right, so you clean the print that way, and then you have to, I believe you have to cure the whole print. So it goes into like this like light chamber thing that spins, and you put it in there for a while, and it cures the whole print. And now the print is safe to handle and use and do whatever with, right? So a lot more work, a lot more steps, and sort of a lot more danger and things involved with it. And it's not that resin printers aren't something that has to be inherently dangerous, but it's not like a filament printer where you can kind of just buy it, throw some filament in it, and print in your room and not have to worry about it. So filament printers filament printers are I would say a lot more beginner friendly. And then if it's something that you really get into and you really enjoy, and say you want to print figurines, like I think it would be really cool to like take this model that I use in Vrchat and print it. You can do that on a filament printer, but it's not going to look as good, and it's going to be harder because there's a lot of intricate details with a character and a model that are just really tricky to try and 3D print, right? Whereas a resin printer can do this relatively easily and come out very detailed. Rio joined chat and called me a vegetable-based plastic. That's why I was giggling earlier. I'm a vegetable-based plastic. Okay. But yeah, so you've got your regular printers, your filament printers, your resin printers, and then there's all kinds of other fun things you can do. I'm getting pretty excited to test out this vacuum pump that I got. For this last, like, I guess couple of weeks, my friends have been just listening to me talk about this stupid thing, and they're probably getting sick of it. I tend to, when I get into something, I tend to get very focused on that thing for a long period of time, and it's like the only thing I can talk about, and I will repeat things that I'm talking about with them quite a bit, to the point where my friends are probably sick and tired of hearing about it. And that's how it's been with this vacuum pump, because I've been diagnosing and trying to fix this thing. I took the whole thing apart and put it back together, and I had to get an inlet nozzle because my parents reused the inlet nozzle from it on their new pump, so that was a whole process. That kind of sucked. Actually, you guys will get a kick out of this. So there's a stupid little inlet, right, on this vacuum pump where it actually pulls the vacuum from where you hook the hose, right? I called the company. I'm like, I can't figure out what the size of the thread is on this thing, and I've gone to local hardware stores, and they don't seem to have the right thing. And I ordered one on Amazon, what I thought was right, and it's way too big. And so I call the company and I tell them this, and they're like, oh, it says here it's a 3/4 inch NPT, which stands for National Pipe Thread. So there's NBT, and then there's like BPT, which is like British pipe thread or something like that. And then there was something else. I can't remember what the other one was. But if something's using one of those standards, then I could just be like, oh, this is a 3/4 inch NBT, and then it will thread to as long as they're the same, then they'll thread, right? So you don't have to worry about thread pitch and all that other stuff. If it's NBT, then it will fit. But when I got it, it was way too big, and the guy was like, oh yeah, it's 3/4 inch NBT, and I was like, well, I bought 3/4 inch NBT, and it's way too big. So either they sent me the wrong thing, or that's not what it is. And the guy is like, yeah, it says here. And it turns out that the inlet nozzle is actually a 3/4 inch NBT for the hose that they put on it, but the thread for that thing going into the machine was actually 1/2 inch NBT. So I had to go to a local plumbing place, and that guy was actually able to figure it out. I basically just took the vacuum pump in and set it on the counter. I was like, hey, I need to get an inlet to connect a nozzle or a hose to this. Can you figure out what it was? And he just went back there and came back with a few different thread things and threaded in a 1/2 inch, and he was like, yeah, it's 1/2 inch. And I was like, oh, well, how in the world did the company that made this dang thing not even know that? And it was also complicated too, because most vacuum pumps use a 1/4 inch or a 3/8 inch NBT. This one's using larger for whatever reason. Yeah, and so that was an endeavor, just trying to get that. And you should have seen when we originally sort of like got the nozzle to hook the hose to this vacuum pump. It was 1/2 inch to, it was a 1/2 inch threaded down to with an adapter to go to a, I want to say 1/4 inch, and then it was a 1/4 inch female with a 1/4 inch male, and then the little nozzle that I had that came with the hose was a female, so it had to be a male two-sided going to the female. And I'm like, there's so many connectors here, and this is a vacuum pump. Like, there's no way this thing's gonna achieve vacuum. Like, one of these is gonna leak, right? Like, it's got to. So we tried a few different things, and instead I bought a new nozzle from him that was male instead of female, and that eliminated that male double-sided thread thing, and so we could just so the vacuum pump's got an adapter going to an adapter to a nozzle or whatever, right? But it works. Now here comes the next struggle. I got this little pot, or vacuum chamber pot, right? It's a 3-gallon pot with a silicone acrylic lid or whatever. And I hook it up to the machine. I've got oil in it now after cleaning it all out, and it had a lot of crud in it. And I run the machine and I watch the pressure gauge, and the pressure gauge goes down and it hits minus like 26 Hg, which is, I think that's pounds of mercury is what that's measured at or whatever. But basically we'll just say Hg because that's what it says on the gauge. So it goes down to minus 26 Hg. And I'm like, okay, cool. And I look it up and I'm like, how much vacuum do I need to pull in order to evacuate gas from like epoxy or silicone? And everywhere I look says like 29.8 or something. And the gauge I have goes to minus 30. And so I'm like, I basically need to be able to bottom out this gauge in order to achieve a total vacuum. Well, I'm only hitting 26. And everywhere I'm looking at is like, that's not enough. You need to be able to pull a full vacuum of minus 30 in order to evacuate gases properly. And I'm like, well, that's not good. This pump can't pull enough vacuum. So I go to my parents' house, and remember, I got this vacuum pump from my parents, and they replaced it with a nicer vacuum pump. And it's currently running. They're using it on their freeze dryer, and it's got a fancier gauge on it too. But I look at the gauge on there, and in Hg, it's pulling minus 26. It's pulling the same as what the old one is I got from them. And I'm like, okay, like what's going on here, right? Because yours is working. It's performing the freeze drying task properly, right? And it's only pulling 26. I'm like, does it not need to pull more for freeze dryers? Right? And so I spent a few days trying to figure this out, and then I jump in a Discord call with a group I hang out with, and at the end of the night most people leave and there's one person left, and I get to talking with him, and he's a friend of mine named Point, and I explain everything I just explained to you guys, all my troubleshooting and problems, and he brings up the key, the moment of revelation. He says, could it have something to do with elevation? And I'm thinking about this like, it could, right? Because if you're at sea level, air is more dense, right? And then the higher in elevation you go, the thinner the oxygen gets, the air gets. So you would think that at different elevations, the pressures would vary. Well, the pressure gauge only goes to minus 30. And they have to know that there's lots of people who live at higher elevations. So I would think that if it needed to pull more vacuum at higher elevations, then the gauge would definitely go higher than 30. So it's probably less. So I Google it, and sure enough, at an elevation of 5,000, a vacuum pump achieves total vacuum at minus 24. Mine's pulling minus 26. I'm not at 5,000 feet. I'm at like 4,800 feet, I think, where I'm living, which might explain why I'm pulling 26. But the point is, it's achieving total vacuum, which is awesome. I just got a $400 vacuum pump. It can pull full vacuum. It pulls it quick too. I noticed from watching videos, watching people run their thing, they're like, yeah, you want to achieve total vacuum to degas like epoxy, for example, right? And they show it doing it, and you'll watch their gauge, and it kind of like goes and it goes. I'm like, yeah, it'll take about, take 5-10 minutes for it to achieve total vacuum, and then you want to hold it for, and I'm like, it takes 5 minutes to achieve total vacuum. I'm like, I'm pretty sure mine goes to total vacuum after like not even 30 seconds. Like it starts going really quick. Like when you first turn it on, it's like whoop it down to like minus 15 pretty quick, and then it kind of slows down, and then minus 26, right? And I think the reason why this vacuum pump pulls total vacuum so fast is it's a 2-stage, and I had to watch videos on this, and I'm turning my talk about printers into a talk about vacuum pumps, but whatever, it's fine. Anyway, it's really cool to understand kind of how a vacuum pump works, I'd recommend watching a video on it. I get really fascinated by technical stuff like this, but basically there's these rotating fins in the vacuum pump, and they're kind of in like a round like chamber, almost like a rotary engine, right? And when it spins, those fins will compress on one side and then expand on the other, and when they pass by the opening for the inlet, it creates an open spot that has negative pressure, like less pressure than atmospheric pressure outside of it, and so it kind of pulls a little bit of air in, right? And then when it goes around to the other side, it compresses again, right? But there's another fin, right? Because there's two fins, one on each side. And that second fin will have passed by that opening, which now traps that air in that space, and it basically pushes it out the other side. Well, these two-stage pumps have two of these right next to each other. So when that first one kind of evacuates that air out the outlet side, it actually sends that into another chamber, which is creating a second vacuum, right? And it's pulling that air and doing the exact same thing, and then pushes it out the exhaust. A one-stage pump, it just does that once. Well, I think those one-stage ones are kind of slow to pull vacuum, whereas the two-stage ones, they can pull it a lot easier, and so they can pull it a lot faster. And that first one can be pretty large. I don't know, basically I'm just excited. I got a $300 vacuum pump that does a really good job creating a vacuum really quickly, and it's probably overkill for what I'm using it for. I really honestly think that if I was to just buy a small vacuum pump and use that just to degas epoxy or silicone, or I keep wanting to say wax, but you don't degas wax, I'm pretty sure, that this would be a small cheap one would be fine. But when you get a vacuum pump for free, why wouldn't you just do, yeah, I don't know. I'm excited to test it. I've actually ordered some silicone in the mail from Amazon. I just ordered the cheap stuff because I just want to test it, and so it should show up. Actually, I think shipping and handling said it would show. Yeah, in any case, it'll show up this next week, and then I'm kind of excited to try and make some kind of 3D printed mold. I actually need to get on that because I should have designed. I need to design something before the silicone shows up, but it'll be fun to play around with that and figure that out. But anyway, I've been rambling for a while about this topic, so we should probably call it good. Go find some interesting videos to watch. Maybe find some interesting things on 3D printers. 3D printers are a lot of fun. If you guys are ever thinking about buying a 3D printer, now is not a bad time to get into it. They're so cheap now, and they're so easy. Oh, there was one last thing I did want to talk about. Keep in mind that when you buy a printer, good filament is really important, and PLA filament can absorb moisture, so you want to try and keep it dry. So a couple of things to think about investing if you do buy a printer. One is a filament dryer, and another one is like the silica packets and like some kind of Tupperware container to store your filament in. So you throw your filament in like a Tupperware container and throw a bunch of these absorbent packets in, just to help make sure that your filament doesn't absorb and like just moisture from the air around you. But a filament dryer is actually something I really want to invest in. It's basically just a little thing that will hold a spool of filament, and then it heats up to a temperature of like 140, 150 degrees, and it will just hold that filament at that temperature, which is hot enough to evaporate the water vapor that can get in the filament, but it's not so hot that the filament will like melt and stick to itself, right? Really want to get one of those, but I don't know. I should look into that. Anyway, getting distracted. Let's get out of here. Let's go watch some videos.